Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of the Fenced In podcast. This week, we're talking about recovery and periodization. You're here with Chris and my co-host, Ben. Hello, Ben.
Hi, how you doing? You all right?
Yeah, I'm very well. How are you doing?
All good, all good. We're hoping by now we have a good solid listener base, so hopefully you should know us. But if you don't, we are both GB International foilists, and actually Chris and I are student and coach. Isn't that right, Chris?
You're a great coach.
He's too kind. He's too kind. He's a good student as well. So Chris and I have been working together for, what is it now, probably 2-3 years?
Yeah, I think a bit longer, actually. I think kind of closer to 3 or 4. We certainly had our first lessons probably about 5 years ago.
We did. And I suppose it's always a really interesting one because Chris and I have been friends for much longer than our kind of working relationship. And so there's always that kind of wonder whether, having a close working relationship as well as a close friendship could actually, put any of that in jeopardy. But I think it hasn't, I like to think, Chris, right?
No, not at all. It brought us closer than ever, which is the right way you want to go. It might be a bust up down the road, but hopefully nothing we can't get past.
Yeah, fingers crossed, fingers crossed. So how's your week been of training?
Yeah, it's been good. It's felt like a bit of a slog actually at times. I'm going to put that down to motivation, but also changing up what I'm doing. Leg days are feeling quite hard, but I've got certain targets in mind. So on my 5K, I want to get that as low as I can. And I've been quite consistent on my 5K and been under 20 minutes for 2 runs in a row, which is quite good. You and I are talking about how to try and push those barriers and make things better. We've discovered routes with less traffic, routes with fewer hills, as well as when you do your run. So not immediately after a leg session or the day after a leg session, because it makes it so much easier to push through when your legs have had a few days rest. So after a weekend break, I think Monday morning first thing. How's your training been going?
Yeah, good. No, it's interesting to say, Chris and I were discussing strength and conditioning in last week's episode. We were talking at quite length about the different aspects that go into physical training, and we were talking a lot about running, and so hence the discussion on that and not eating directly after food and preparing right and stuff like that. So Chris is actually on tenterhooks waiting for a new set of trainers, which he's chomping at the bit to get. So, but actually this leads us quite nicely onto kind of the idea of periodization and recovery. Chris, should we start with recovery? Is that kind of a good one to start with?
Yeah, let's go for that. So I'm going to throw in the first question. What's recovery?
Recovery is pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. And so to flesh it out a bit more, recovery for me can be done in many different ways, but it is the healing process, the relaxation, the mental decompression from training and competing. And I suppose that this is quite key for many athletes, is to get recovery right. And actually, when you get it wrong, there is a lot of warning signs, and there's also a huge dip in performance usually. So, it's certainly Chris and I talk about being slightly older athletes. I'm 29, about to turn 30 this year. And so I would consider myself probably as a slightly older athlete now. My body doesn't recover like it's 21 anymore.
I'd say you're in your peak.
Well, he's too kind. He's too kind. But I mean, Chris, do you find that your body does recover differently from when you were kind of 20 years old?
It's so hard to know. I think I do so much more now than I did then. So any recovery I have actually kind of feels the same. If anything, I feel better because I do so much more stretching. You've been doing this professionally for much longer than I have. You work your training in very different ways, and I now stretch every morning, every evening. I train in different ways and I do different things, whereas I didn't necessarily do that. But I didn't find that I necessarily missed it early on, if that makes sense. So I suppose my body probably does respond differently. It's so hard to know, isn't it? Because there are so many changes in our life. You train differently, you eat differently, you live a different lifestyle now than you did then. When you say you feel different, how do you feel?
You're absolutely right there, and it's probably something I should have clarified more, which is you're right. As you get older, your body can also take a greater workload because obviously over time the capacity to be able to train more is bigger. And actually, I was speaking to probably both my coaches, actually both Pavel and Graham, recently about the podcast and what we're doing here, and they were saying it's quite an important factor that people listening need to understand kind of exactly where we're coming from a training point of view. And I suppose that people that are training on a regular basis, when I'm talking about a regular basis, I'm talking over kind of twice a week. If you're someone that trains once, twice a week, that's fine. That's great. And there are many, many, many bits of information you can kind of take away from this podcast. But I think that anybody training 3 times a week and over can really start to use this information in a real performance-based way. And I think that this is where recovery is key. And you're right. I take a big load with my training now, more though than I used to when I was kind of 20 years old. But therefore, recovery becomes almost more important. And I suppose that for me, waking up in the mornings, there's a few more stiff joints and aching muscles than there was when I was younger. But then, is that because I'm getting older, or is it conversely because I've got more workload? It is hard to tell. You are right.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like you mentioned before, for me, recovery is about giving muscles a break, usually because they need to grow or they need to repair. And that can be done in different ways. There are different types of recovery. There's rest, which is the most obvious one. So actually giving muscles a break altogether. And sometimes that can be really helpful with just a week off or doing nothing. And sometimes you need that. We've spoken recently about the need for a deload week. We've been in lockdown now for, I forget the actual number of weeks, I think kind of 7 or 8 weeks.
Feels like that, that's for sure.
Yeah, it feels like a while. In that time, we've been training quite consistently and quite hard. Actually, about now is probably when we need a kind of an easier week. Either way, we do nothing, or we change things up a little bit. But just let our bodies remember that these things can be fun and not just hard. The other types of rest that are really handy are active rest, so working different muscle groups. So if one muscle group is tired, you can work a secondary muscle group without necessarily affecting the first one and keeping things going without going into huge levels of fatigue. And that's all about training smarter and not just harder. For example, you wouldn't do a heavy weight session on the same muscle groups every single day of the week because you wouldn't see any gains in that and you'd just be knackered. You wouldn't be able to complete it. But if you were to alternate those groups, you do leg one day, core and upper body the next day, then back to leg, and then core and upper body, and throw some stuff in that. And it doesn't have to be those groups exactly, but switching that up, that can be really handy. Equally, alternating between kind of runs or swimming as cardio is again really helpful. And another type of recovery is stretching, which obviously doesn't necessarily work anything, and things like yoga do, but stretching in itself is a sense of relief, but again gives your muscles a break to do what they need. Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, completely. I think you've hit a lot of good topics there on recovery. As we've mentioned to the listeners before, Chris and I always fire over a few notes to each other to make sure that we're both singing from the same hymn sheet. And when we spoke about recovery, there were several aspects of that. You had diet, rest and sleep, active recovery. I put instruments, which I'll come back to later, and as well as kit and travel. And so there are lots of different types of recovery. Just to kind of flesh it out a bit, diet is obviously really important. Something we touched on last week with protein shakes and even stuff that you would take during sessions, and even just making sure you get your diet in at the right time. But actually that will come later because next week we are doing a episode on nutrition. And as Chris said, rest and sleep is hugely important. Actually, for me, I nap a lot because it's part of my daily routine to recover. When I do a session in the morning and then I'm driving to my second session where I go to the club, if it's a session where I'm either coaching or I'm fencing, I still need that nap in the in the afternoon. And the reason for that is because it makes me at my best for either being able to deliver my best coaching skill to the people I'm working with, or to deliver my best performance at training.
And that doesn't surprise me really, because as you've just mentioned, you're a coach as well. And not just that, you've got many more commitments beyond just your fencing. So I'm absolutely sure that will be the case for most fencers, especially most fencers who aren't at an elite level. They'll be juggling their fencing and their training alongside a job, or being a parent or at home or whatever the other thing is that they're doing. And so therefore, as you just said, I think something like napping can be essential. Funnily enough, at the Commonwealth last year or a year and a half ago now, Keith Cook, who's one of my teammates, said every day he has his 23-minute nap. And
23
nice. 23 exactly. Set the timer for 23 minutes when you put your head on the pillow. It doesn't sound like long enough, but actually you wake up feeling really refreshed. And when I came back, my wife and I started doing it, and it's amazing. Every day, I think for a few weeks or a few months we did it, and we felt fantastic. And actually we haven't done it for a while. Now would be an ideal time, but it was really, really good. It's just gives you that little boost in the day, and you will know about that because you're, as you said, Ben, you take naps in your car, don't you, before the club?
Yeah, I do. My little Honda Jazz, bless it, it's got a pillow in there. It's got it's even got a quilt for when it's cold in the winter. So Richard Cruz is the king of naps. This man can nap anywhere. You'll often walk into Leon Pool Centre after we've had a big session, and you will find Richard almost laying in the middle of the cell. No noise can wake this man. And actually, I kind of started following his routine because it worked so well for him, and it now does me. And actually, we're a 20-minute napper. But 20 minutes is perfect for us. And I think people have to understand that the kind of science behind that, not that I've looked extensively at the research, but basically we have a sleep cycle we want to avoid going into for naps. And that's your REM sleep, your random eye movement, I think I believe it's called. And if you go into that deeper cycle of your sleep, that can actually make you wake up feeling groggy and quite hard to come out of, because you've actually interrupted the deepest part of your sleep. So the idea of that kind of quick cat nap almost is to just refresh the brain, give the chance the whole body to shut down and then kind of restart up again. It's almost like turn your phone on off. Again, it's important that we get that, and I do feel more refreshed. So napping is a good thing, and actually something that I'd recommended to one of the athletes that I work with on a regular basis. But as well as that, the other things that we mentioned were the active recovery, instruments, kit, and travel. And the active recovery, as Chris said, is quite important, because active recovery can be seen in many ways. Quite rightly, as Chris said, it could be where you have almost a deload week. And I think at the moment in time, when we're in our volume part of training, which is effectively now, because there are no competitions horizon, we can make lots of volume gains physically because we're not able to get into the fencing cell. And so right now, I think it's important that actually people do make sure they look at how much training they're doing and think about, when you start to make those gains. As Chris said, he's talking about running his 5Ks, and actually at the moment in time, you just set some what are PVs, right? So now could be a good time to almost kind of, if the time starts to go the other way, actually take a deload week where it's a lot less volume, it's a lot more quality, shorter, sharper sessions, and that kind of active recovery week would do you really well and super compensate you into the following week.
Yeah, absolutely. And what can be really interesting is sometimes when times go up, for example, for a run, or you're not feeling as good in your fencing, or something isn't feeling right in your training, often it means you need a bit of a break. But what can be really hard to identify is, am I training enough, or am I training too much? Am I tired, or am I not fit enough? And same with food. You can often wonder whether you're eating too much or too little. And it can be quite a hard balance to find, but often what you can do is just take notes of kind of what you've been doing. I don't mean keeping a permanent diary of everything you've been doing, but say, on this day I went for that run, on that day I did this training, and I've been doing that for a while. When did I last take a break? As you've said, using logic, we can start to interpret when we think we really need to have these little breaks, and you can have big gains from them. You can really feel a boost.
Yeah, completely, Chris. You're right. And actually, to be honest, a training diary is really important. And I think many athletes would champion a training diary. And, we've all got a diary in our calendar, in our phones. And actually, we can note down how many fights we've had or what we're doing at the moment. And so then you can start to see patterns. And I think a lot of people say, well, what is the science behind recovery? Well, there's lots of science behind recovery. But ultimately, it does come down to a fencer's experience. It does come down to a little bit of trial and error about knowing how much you need. When you're younger, recovery is important, of course, because as Chris said, things like stretching after club sessions when the muscles are really hot, they need to make sure they're cooled down appropriately. But at the same time, that's an important part of a young athlete's recovery, and it's a habit that will set them up for the rest of their life. They will also be able to do more volume purely because their body recovers so much faster. As you get older, and actually one of the things that Richard talks quite a lot is that he does lots and lots and lots of stretching. And actually, he trains probably far less than he did when he was 21, purely because he knows that it's more about quality. As he's got older, his body can't necessarily take as much volume, not because he's not fit enough, but because he's got more of a focused session. And when he does those, the quality is really up, but he doesn't necessarily need to put all the load in because purely the amount of experience he has.
I just want to jump in with something I saw this week I found really interesting is, do you know Bas Vermeulen? I think that's how you say it. The épée fencer, Dutch épée fencer. Bas.
Oh, yeah. Bas, yeah. Absolutely.
I'm just going to refer to him as Bas. I want to get his surname wrong. There was a piece on him from the FIE website.
I saw this
week. So I think you know what I'm going to say,
yeah,
which is that there was a quote in there saying when he was a teenager, he fenced 3 times a day, and now he fences probably twice a week. And it's all about that quality. I mean, it's an interesting one because you can't get to that point where you just fence twice a week and have the really good result without having done the load work at some stage in your career. But it's interesting, as you said, with Richard, and I'm sure with many other athletes as well, sometimes the less they fence, the better things get, because there's a state of relaxation physically and mentally.
It hits the nail on the head, and it kind of, it really does sum up the idea of how recovery is important throughout an athlete's career. But also as we get older, recovery is key. And so actually doing more quality than quantity is quite important. It's something I'm noticing as I'm getting older as an athlete as well. But yeah, so active recovery, deload week, things like that, things like active recovery. One of the things that I find is that when we travel long distances, and Chris, you and I both found this when we went to Australia, that was a mammoth travel going out to Australia. And that really plays a lot of toll on the body. And actually, we would have done our tapering, which we'll come into next with periodization. But we'd done our tapering, we'd done all the volume work, we'd really got the quality down to a T, and we're ready to go out there. And so we're looking on fine form. And then you travel this way and your body just feels beaten up and bruised because of being stuck in a tin can for almost 24 hours. And the first thing that is good to do is to, get off the plane and go for a run, because a light bit of activity can help the body recover much faster than just sitting in a hotel room.
I've definitely heard Richard, when being interviewed, say things like that as well. And actually, I mean, we're going to go into periodization in a minute, but when he's landed somewhere just before a competition, for a few days, maybe a week before, he won't do any fencing, but he will do, he will go for a run, do lots of stretching. And there are lots of athletes beyond fencing who are going for longer and longer and longer in their careers. Like Ryan Giggs, I think, played Premiership football and won titles until he was 40.
Yeah.
And lots of other players do as well, and tennis players, and they all attribute that to yoga, but stretching, but understanding their body and understanding training better than they did. There's a professional footballer in Japan. He plays in the second division. He's professional. He's paid,
Yeah.
and I think he's 51. He's a striker.
Wow.
That's amazing. And he's just had his contract renewed as well. I mean, that kind of thing I think is unheard of in any professional league. You get player managers sometimes in, much lower divisions in England, but there can only really be one of two reasons for that. Either he's a freak of nature and he's amazing, or he's...
Yeah, but you have that example in men's sabre. You have the Olympic champion Montano from Italy. He won the Olympic gold medal individually in Athens, I believe. And he was fencing in London, and I think around his 40th birthday, I believe. And so this guy's into his 40s, and he's a decorated athlete. But again, he's focusing on his recovery. He's making sure that actually his body keeps going and pushing into those slightly more twilight years, because he's looking after himself. Not only is he doing the physical training, not only is he doing the sparring, but he's also actively looking after the recovery aspect from the training, because when your body doesn't recover as fast, you need to be able to do the things that will help it recover faster. And we spoke about long distance travel and going for light runs and actually doing things rather than just going, well, I'm tired because I've got off a plane, I'm just going to sit in a hotel room. Don't go out, get some fresh air, go for a walk, go for a run, do some stretching in the park, because all those things are considered active recovery to bounce back from long travel. And I mentioned kit. When I travel long periods of time, I wear my compression leggings. I'm sure those that follow me on social media know that I'm sponsored by Chimera, who are an undergarment-based company. They use this technology, infrared technology, within the weave of their kit to help your body recover faster. And so not only do I train with the kit, I also use it for active recovery as well. And I use their leggings when I fly because they have a compression element to them, which means that the legs feel a little less tired when getting off a plane, but also sleeping in them after big sessions, because again, that compression factor, it really helps stimulate the blood flow and the recovery to the legs.
That's really interesting. I don't have any Chimera kit, but I have definitely looked at getting some Chimera kit for when my compression gear finally dies a death and needs to be replaced. But I do find that when I'm training with compression gear on, I do feel better, later on that next day. So it obviously works. I don't know lots of the science behind it, but definitely, championing the use of those things. I've never myself worn them for recovery, so I've never slept in it or kind of worn it on a plane or anything, but I know other people that have, and they all say it works wonders. Actually, I think the other person was one of your pupils who got the idea from you.
Yeah, might have been. I know Marcus is a big fan. He's got lots of compression based stuff, and it's been very, very good, and it's obviously good to both training but also for recovery as well. And I might stress that I only tend to wear these after really big volume blocks rather than and international travel rather than every single night. I'm not getting into bed every single night looking like a swimmer. They are good pieces of kit. And in that list that I mentioned earlier on, this kind of brings us on to instruments, which sounds a bit torturous and horrible, but we touched on it a few episodes ago with the idea of foam rollers and things like the peanut, which is kind of two tennis balls like kind of taped together for your lower back and things like that, and even just massage balls for your foot and things like that. One of the things that I found recently with my physio, which was really cool, and actually you can now buy them online, although I certainly wouldn't, because I don't know the science behind it or how to use it, but like this scraper thing, it looks like a blade, but it's not sharp. I had a small forearm injury, and they rub this what is a dull blade up and down your arm, and it's meant to break down some of the rubbish that kind of gets into the muscles and help stimulate new blood flow and things like that. But it was a really good piece of kit. And so going to physios and things like that and talking to them about recovery, or if you can't see a physio because you don't have one near you or you don't have access to one, do the research. There's loads of foam rollers out there that you can kind of get your hands on, and they're really cheap now. And you can get your hands on massage balls, the trigger point balls. And, there are lots of books out there on the understanding of massage and doing self-massage and seeing where things are tight, because when you get fatigue, you get tightness, you get muscle soreness, and actually trying to release those off is really important so that you can feel better and more recovered for your next session.
something you haven't mentioned, but we've mentioned before, are spiky balls. I've actually got a set of 3 with different tensions. Not that I use the different tensions. I just put one under each foot and say go. But that,
Golf
you know,
balls are the same thing. Golf balls
golf.
are
Oh
great.
yeah, golf balls. Golf balls are brilliant. But also, talking of foam rollers, I've got one in London and I've got one here. The one I've got here is useful to have. I'm glad to have it. But the one in London is my proper kind of spiky,
Okay.
hollow inside, like horrible grooves on it. Really kind of works into everything. The one here is basically just a round cylinder that
Okay. Yeah.
that I can feel doesn't do the same thing anymore. They're really handy to have, and I thought I was hitting all my markers, and I was like, oh well, I don't do, I don't do that muscle group, but it's okay. It can't be that important. Then I looked online and saw somebody doing a half-hour foam roll, kind of compression and stretch, and I thought, man, I need to be working so much harder at this because there are so many gains and releases to be made in all of that. So that you feel so good for it. You sleep so much better. You feel loose. You feel like a bit like when you've got new shoes, new trainers, and you're kind of walking on clouds.
Yeah, and it's good for the mental stimulation as well. It helps you kind of decompress after a session too. And even those big elastic power bands, getting those wrapping around those things and using that as a bit of resistance to go into the stretch even deeper, they're particularly good. As you say, you not only get a physiological benefit, Chris, as you said, you get the mental kind of relaxation and de-stimulation of that.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here and say, have you seen Casa de Babel, which is Money Heist in English on Netflix?
Oh no, I think Lucy's watched it. I haven't seen it myself.
Oh, it's so good. There's a character in it called the Professor, and whenever he needs kind of some mental stimulation, he's a mastermind behind all this stuff. When he needs mental stimulation, he goes to the punch bag and just starts boxing for half an hour, and it gets the juices flowing, he gets more ideas. I don't know how much science there is behind that, but I could believe it.
Yeah, true. I mean, look, any form of exercise is great mentally, and I think people don't understand cooling down and the idea of recovery because it feels like an extra thing to do. And I know that both Pavel and Dom at the club work very hard with the kids from a very early age, getting them to kind of have that habitual approach to training of recovery is just part of it. The same way you would take a lesson, the same way that you would, make sure you wear your underplastron when you're fencing, it all becomes just part of it. And when those good habits are put in from an early age, then it becomes something second nature. But it doesn't mean that people can't start implementing this now. I mean, Chris, you and I both train at Saxon on a Thursday. I take, we have our lesson together. And actually, I also take my lesson from Graham, my other coach. And Graham has always got these little instruments of recovery that he brings in, these huge mace-like kind of foam rollers. And a lot of people say, oh, it really hurts, it really hurts. Well, it does hurt, but you do actually become desensitized to it over time. And going back to last week's episode, you can actually use foam rollers for activation as well to stimulate blood flow to certain muscle groups too. So they are part of any fencer's kit now, really. And I think the one thing that always impresses me about Chris is that irrespective of the time and how much we're being told to get out of the hall by the janitor, he's always there making sure he's doing his stretching. And that's very hard for athletes that are club-based fencers because in the evening there's not a lot of time. But I would say that actually it would benefit somebody far more to go to a club session, do a really good activation, warm up, dynamic stretching session like we spoke about, and then actually maybe stop 20, 30 minutes early and do a really good recovery, because these things will benefit you in the long run and give you performance gains to keep training at a high level and actually be at your best at competition.
Yeah, and nobody ever said, man, I wish I hadn't warmed up.
Yeah.
I wish I hadn't warmed up. I wish I hadn't cooled down. Damn, that really screwed me up.
It's a perfect excuse. Everyone goes, oh, you got me when I was cold. Well, you shouldn't be cold. Get warm. And actually, when people get home after a long club session in the evening, they often find that, they're wired, they're quite awake, and, they can't get to sleep. And the idea of just starting that whole recovery process, which goes from finishing on the piece to starting your cool down. And do you know what? Like, actually, I know, Chris, you do this as well. And actually, one of my other students, John, does the same thing. Not only is there a little bit of stretching down at the club, but when you get home and you're eating and you're decompressing, that's a time when you probably do a little bit more stretching. And, for me personally, some of the things that I do when I get back is that's when I do some of my mindfulness as well, because it just helps bring the mind down, decompress a little bit to actually help you sleep better, which is all part of making sure you're fully recovered for the next day, because sleep is massively important. In fact, so much so, I remember at one time I was going to bed with not only my leggings on, an eye patch as well, because I was trying to block out all the light, and I was even trying these nasal strips to help me breathe better at night. So I was going to bed looking like a strange pirate. But actually, you know what? It really helped. Blocking out light, made sure I was in deeper sleep. I wasn't getting woken up so early. Nasal strips would help me breathe better. and then obviously the compression leggings as well. I hasten that, and I don't do that all the time now, but in extreme volume blocks of training, it has been known to happen.
Yeah, well, these are all sleep aids. They're essential. We really need them. And actually, you mentioned kind of after training in the evening, on my drive home after training, I am buzzing. And I get home and I could do 6 hours of work on the computer. And actually, sometimes I do kind of go down that rabbit hole where like, well, I've just got this thing to do quickly. And I'm so productive. But by the time you get home and you've had some food, it's kind of 10:30, 11 o'clock. I have to stop myself from doing too much because otherwise I won't fall asleep until 1 o'clock. And that can be very hard. And, you talk about training aids and sleeping aids, and these things are all really useful. An eye mask, earplugs, nasal strips. Yeah. There's a reason we kind of use these on flights if we'll ever fly again. You personally, I tend to sleep quite well on a flight, but I've got my system worked out for me now. I kind of go on in relaxed gear. I don't wear compression stuff, but tracksuit, bottoms, and a hoodie. And then if it's a long flight, an overnight where there's kind of sleep involved, I've got those Uniqlo light coats that kind of pack down
they're
like a cylinder.
They're so good.
They're so good. I use that as a neck pillow. Hood up, noise cancelling headphones on with an eye mask, and I'm out of it. I can't nap anywhere, but I find that on flights I'm okay. And I think, like all of these things, state of mind is really important. But if you need something to help you be in a more relaxed state, use whatever you need. And I think the same applies to training aids or sleep aids or anything. If you feel like in order to do more stretching you need to have a yoga mat, then get a yoga mat. If the floor's hurting your back or something, then do all this stuff. Just you should use whatever's.
Now we've got more time at home, like you're saying, we can do all of this kind of stuff. And actually, go on Amazon. We've all got a bit more time now to kind of explore Amazon, all the things it's got, and look at buying some of these things. Yoga mats are perfect. We've got 2 here, and they are really good for actually getting a bit of grip as well, because sometimes stretching on the floor can be uncomfortable, but also sometimes you can lose grip, if you're on a shiny surface or whatever. So they're really good. But I'm sure Chris won't mind me telling you quite a funny story about him in terms of his. He's just mentioned that he sleeps very well on planes. But when we were out on our way to the Commonwealth, when he landed, we were all in Sydney together doing a training camp beforehand, and Chris grabbed one thing that was essential to his sleeping arrangement on the flight on the way over, which was his neck pillow. So he grabbed his neck pillow, and when he felt slightly tired on the flight, ready to get in his recovery for this long flight and making sure he got his sleep, he whipped out his neck pillow and started blowing this up. Now, in the process of blowing this up, it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and he was suddenly like, what did I pick up at home? So it turned out that Chris had actually picked up his wife's pillow that she wrapped around her midriff in order to breastfeed their young daughter at the time. So this is a massive pillow that goes around someone's midriff, right? This is almost half.
It's so big.
and I just have this lovely image of Chris slowly blowing up, which looks like a massive donut in the middle of a flight. It just tickled me so much, and I couldn't stop laughing when you told me that story.
Do you know, I wish I could say it was a mistake. What actually happened is I didn't have a neck pillow, and I thought that would do the trick. So I didn't really realize how big it was. And the funny thing is as well, it's kind of white or like cream colored, covered in like grey stars. So
amazing.
It looks quite babyish, and I couldn't believe it. The kind of bigger it got, it went beyond my seat. It kind of, it just kept going, and I was like, well, this isn't going to do the trick yet. And then it kind of overspilled into the seat next to me, and the person's elbow was pushing up against it. I was just like, I can't do this. I've got to deflate it. I didn't even deflate it. I just shoved it down and pretended it didn't exist, and hoped that nobody had really seen me. Oh man.
I thought it was brilliant. But actually, after that little anecdote, that kind of sums up recovery. Get your recovery right in as many different ways as you can, because it is important to performance. But actually, that brings us quite nicely on to periodization. Chris, what's periodization to you?
So periodization is peaking at certain times, targeting your training, and knowing what you're looking for. So it's not possible necessarily to be on peak 12 months of the year. That's why we have summer off. That's why the season is structured as it is. That's why the Olympics are at the end of a season in a 4-year cycle. And same with World Championships and European Championships, which obviously I've never been to.
All in good time.
In satellites are at the beginning of the season, the kind of FIE speaking, they're the kind of least important. they're kind of a way for people to kind of build up into the World Cup season. So it's all about highs and lows, peaks and troughs, I believe, in your training and targeting performance. Do you agree with that?
No, absolutely, Chris. Hit the nail on the head again. I think the periodization is kind of the understanding of what key aspects you want to get into your training block before you want to hit a major competition and peak for that. And there'll be some competitions when you don't want to peak. Some people use competitions as warm-ups, and that's great. That makes a lot of sense. I think the most important thing about kind of periodization is kind of knowing what your goals are first. I always do a kind of work back strategy. So, when you have a world champs or Commonwealths or Olympic Games or European champs or whatever, a major event that you kind of want to peak at, then you kind of have that date in the diary and you work backwards from that. We look at a kind of 6 to 8 week cycle, or certainly I do anyway. People kind of wonder how I know that. And honestly, it's just down to trial and error. I know when I peak based on a certain amount of time, just purely because of trial and error. And so mine is a kind of 6 to 8 week cycle. And obviously you want to kind of get your volume in before that. And so that's kind of the six weeks is a real good block of kind of technical training, I would say. But before that, you probably want to get in a few weeks of a good physical block as well, and then be looking to maintain that. So at the moment in time, this is why I'm working very hard on my physical training, and then hopefully I can return and then do a good kind of 6 to 8 week block leading up to any major event that I'm kind of looking at. So I work backwards from that. So that obviously includes your technical training, and like I spoke about, your physical training, even things like your psychology and things like that. So they're all really important.
How do you find competitions actually fit into your kind of training blocks and your training cycles? Because the level I'm fencing at, which is high national, with satellites in there as well, this isn't always possible. In the UK, competitions are scheduled whenever clubs and organisers can fit them into a calendar. This season I had, I think, kind of 6 tournaments in 8 weeks or something that were all quite important, and then practically nothing until March. And actually the week before that competition was due to take place, when there were going to be 3 and 4 weeks, again, all quite important, everything was cancelled. But I had that block of 3 or 4 months where effectively I didn't have a competition. And that's really hard sometimes to keep training for. Do you have that at world level, or do you find that they've structured the competitions in a way that supports peaking and periodization?
Yeah, it's tricky. And you're right. I would say the lower down the levels you go, it's about fitting the competitions in as and where they can be. And at high international level, you tend to find the competitions are better structured, but I wouldn't say it always necessarily favors the athlete. I think it's really important to kind of look at the block that you certainly mentioned the satellite block. And I think a lot of high level national fencers that our listeners will understand that actually that is quite a brutal block, and that you need to obviously do all of your kind of training up until that point. We talk often about tapering, and for me, again, tapering can be quite individual. I tend to find that if I have for the week before a competition, it's kind of train hard. So for example, if it's a World Cup, it's going to be Friday, Saturday, Sunday I'm competing, so therefore I'm traveling Thursday. So Wednesday becomes packing day, and a day where I'm getting all of the final bits and bobs together before I travel. So Tuesday would kind of be like my real just quality day, where I'm just probably just taking a lesson, doing a lot of stretching, getting the food right, all that kind of stuff. So again, obviously some stimulation in there, having a short lesson, maybe light recovery run and some stretching, because I'm still working out. I'm not losing kind of touch with the game, but and I'm still being stimulated, but nowhere near in high volumes. And Monday would obviously be a quite a normal session. So that's what kind of like a World Cup week would look like for me. And I know that some athletes, certainly Richard at times, has to take longer than that. So what he does, he actually trains on the Sunday and then takes a day earlier. So everything becomes shifted back slightly. So again, you have to know what's right for you and how that kind of looks. But when you're going into a big, heavy block of competition, you almost want to bounce from one competition to the next. And when you're traveling back from a competition, that in itself takes a lot out of you. I know that if I've had kind of Friday, Saturday, Sunday competing at a World Cup, and say there's only 1 weekend between, by the time I'm flying back on the Monday, probably take the Tuesday off to completely recover from everything that went into the week itself. Then probably do a light session on Wednesday, heavier Thursday, Friday, the weekend off. And then again, it's the week before a competition. So again, I would go through that kind of process in the week that I just explained. So you then get good at what will become a routine. And so again, working back, if you've got a particularly heavy block where some of the satellites are weekend after weekend, it's almost like travel out, compete maybe Saturday, coming back on the Sunday. And again, probably no training on the Monday, little light session on the Tuesday, Wednesday off, then, or even if you're not traveling until a Friday. So again, you just try and look at when each date is and work back from that, and then put in what is a deload day, kind of stimulation day, but not overly heavy training, and one day of just completely getting your head out the game, bit of packing, sitting in front of Netflix, chilling out, getting prepared mechanically for everything that kind of goes into that. And if you've had a heavy block of 3 or 4 competitions on the bounce, you may actually need to take a little bit more as you get deeper into the season.
Rory McIlroy had a saying. I don't know if it was his saying actually, but I think it was his saying. Well, I heard that he said this anyway. Is that kind of when he takes the glove off, when he takes the golfing glove off, the glove is off, and he's not thinking about golfing. And that, what you were just talking about, kind of chilling with friends, Netflix, having time with your head out of the game is really important, because it's very easy for it to be all consuming. It's all you think about. And that's not necessarily always a good thing. You need a break, and a cognitive break from all of this stuff. So I just wanted to jump in and say I think that's quite interesting, because I've found that in the past as well. And it's been something I've thought of as well. So sometimes, depending on kind of how busy I am or kind of what's going on, or, it's important to recognize that there are things outside of the game. When I'm home, that's it. My training sometimes is done, and I can just fully engage with my family, my wife and my daughter, or just kind of sitting and watching something or painting on the table. And that can be really quite energizing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you do need that mental recovery as well. Zemek, who is Rich's coach, always says you want to go in hungry to pick up a foil. And it's very true. You don't want to go out there thinking, oh my God, I've got to do this again. So that's the kind of mental rust you can get there. So I think it's really important to understand that it's both the physiological recovery as well as the psychological recovery. So the idea of periodization is doing what works for you. You can play with things, but obviously bear in mind that the deeper you get into season, it's like taking energy out of a tank. And even though you do your recovery and you refill that tank, you will never refill it to 100%. And so over the course of the season, you need to understand there will be depletions that happen that you can't top back up again. And so those recovery days become potentially more and needed in greater depth. So look at where you want to peak throughout the season and work backwards from there. See where you want your recovery days, see where you want your volume training, and see where you want your more quality based training as well. And when you've worked back, you suddenly find that where you are now and what you got to do. And for some people, it can be 6 to 8 weeks. For other people, it might be 5 to 7. But for other people, it could be as much as 10 weeks. You just have to know yourself with a bit of trial and error, unfortunately, sometimes. But you can go on guidance from your coach about their experience, what they've seen in athletes.
Yeah, and so I'm just going to go in with my own periodization as well. So as you've said, I spend 4 days a week, and then when there's a competition, I'll take one of those sessions out so that I'll have an extra rest day, or on that rest day I'll go for a run instead. Not very far, just 5k, but just to kind of keep the blood moving, keep things active, but without really killing myself or hurting fencing in a way that might happen. And also, one session before a competition, one extra session isn't really going to make a difference. But being more relaxed, I think probably will really help. Obviously, we're only talking about fencing at the moment, but, in pre-season, in those 6 to 8 weeks in pre-season over the summer, or when you've got a block where you can target a competition, I would do heavy lifting. And so you'd probably do heavy lifting work. And I'm talking about the really heavy deadlifts, squats, leg press, etc., 3 times a week. What I've always been a bit rusty about is how that heavy work fits into the rest of the season. Does that heavy work kind of stay with you? The gains that you've made in that season, does that stay with you for kind of 6 months to a year without necessarily continuing to do it? Or is it something that you've just got to find for yourself? If you've done 6 weeks of really heavy lifting, and then you've got 6 weeks of competitions, 4 competitions in 6 weeks, or 3 competitions in 6 weeks, where you don't want to overload the body, do you cut out that heavy lifting and replace it with something else, or do you just give it a break? Or is this something you
do? It's rough, and it can be really frustrating sometimes. I agree completely. That is one of the things you have to kind of work out. And I suppose for me, you can go from lifting 3 to 4 times a week and managing fencing in your volume block, or certainly lessons. And then as you kind of get deeper into fencing, it becomes slightly less and less. And then, right up until competition, the week before a competition, I don't lift, but you can do kind of more speed agility based stuff, more like band explosivity, with the power bands, those kind of stuff, to still give you that kind of nervous system hit. But you're right, Chris, you do find that after doing a major volume block, it starts to kind of, by the end of the season, drop off again. That's why it's important in those breaks in the season before St. Petersburg. There's quite a nice kind of month and a bit gap there. And that's when not only can you take a kind of week's rest, but then actually can you build back up on a bit of volume, because even though you've done all your volume work, you may need to kind of top that up for what you may have lost because you're in a kind of heavy fencing block, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really good to know. And also, I think it's part of that worth understanding your own training, but also understanding that sometimes as part of this, you will feel like crap. You
Yeah.
will feel like your fencing isn't going so well, but there's a reason for that. There's change under, your body is changing and adapting, and a bit like when a 14-year-old is much taller than everyone else or much shorter, and then suddenly growing and their distance is changing. They might struggle a bit because their distance is changing. They're not really sure where their point is all the time. And we have the same thing. We're not necessarily growing anymore, getting stronger or fitter or more explosive, and all these things are kind of moving variables, and understanding that sometimes your fencing will feel like crap, but there's always an end to that barrier. So you just have to make sure to push through it, because you'll come out the other end so much happier. The number of times I've been through that, and it feels awful. It really feels like you want to quit. And I remember calling Dom, a coach at your club. This was years ago. I think this was after the Bristol Open, before they brought it back. And I just had one of the worst performances of my life. I felt so down. We had a good chat, and she said, I've been there. Just keep going. You'll be through it soon, and you'll never look back. And it's so true. And I'm sure you felt like that as well, because sometimes you can feel like you're on a real high. And when you're fencing and everything's really clicking and going well, that's what we do it for. Those moments of gold dust. And then there are other times when we're just chasing everything. It feels like we can't hit a barn door.
No, I agree. And actually, you know what? You're right. That the idea of super compensation, about kind of working until it's almost not working anymore, and then taking a break and then seeing the effects come back. So yeah, no, completely. I think that and people are probably wondering, well, how does this apply right now? How can we do this in lockdown? Well, you know what? You can do a seasons review. You can go back and look at all the competitions you've competed at. Where were your performances? Where were the ones that you really peaked at? And actually, was there anything in your training that you did, or any blocks of training that you think helped towards that kind of peak? And if you haven't actually got any of that data to look at, then start a training diary now. Why not? You're in lockdown. Go and buy a diary and actually start noting down kind of what you're doing every day and how you're feeling as well. I think it's really important. One of the things I'm doing, the athletes I work with at the moment, is the idea of kind of measurement of how you feel on a daily basis, daily kind of checking in. How did I feel after today's session? How is it looking? And you'll see trends, not throughout the week, but throughout the month, of how you're feeling at certain points. And so using this information right now is actually a great weapon to kind of throw you into the next part of the season when things do arrive, about how you can kind of best set yourself up. And we hope that this podcast is giving the information people need, not only to kind of understand what's going on in lockdown right now, but also what can be done to aid you, that you can do right now, that's going to help you when we come out of this. And I suppose right now, with the idea of periodization and recovery, with the recovery, get online, buy some stuff off of Amazon, and actually set up a whole recovery routine. Look at some books on stretching, look at some books on even things like ice bathing, things like that. Look at everything to do with what is considered recovery, and actually build a recovery routine into your training at the moment. Am I doing my cooling down, my foam rolling? Am I sleeping well enough? Am I not sleeping well enough at night? How can I change that? So all these things you can be doing right now in lockdown. And actually with the periodization, how can I look at having a plan that looks like a good build up to a competition? Almost write a kind of like phantom season, what a great season would look like, what competitions you want to hit, and how much time you think you need between each competition to prepare in the right way. You can do all of this now, sitting in the living room on a laptop with a piece of paper and a pen, even looking back at fights that you've done before, and where the good fights were, where the bad fights were, and start to reflect a little bit, because that will really help.
That's really good advice, especially the idea of a training program, looking ahead and creating a training program to try and hit those targets and make that possible. And I think this leads quite nicely into the Ask Us Anything section, where we have a question from Nick Payne, who is an ex-GB foilist.
He is, yeah.
Yeah, fencing at the highest level, and is now coach at Epsom Fencing Club and a director at his fencing-based corporate team building company called Sword Fighting International. So his question is, mental training is being used a lot more now for high-level athletes. How might it be different for lower levels, for example, county or national fencers, who have less experience of different opponents? And how do you visualize an upcoming fight against an opponent you've lost?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I've just worked with Nick recently. We did a really good train with Team GB day, actually. And Nick is so insightful and has got so much experience under his belt. But this is a great question. And I think that there is a lot of mental training that goes into high-level athletes. But I think that young fencers, or even less experienced fencers, or slightly lower tiers, kind of county-level fencers, they can still look at doing some kind of mental training, some kind of psychological skill-based training. And actually, one of the things that I saw recently was some eye-tracking-based stuff that looked really really great, because I'm problem solving based stuff. And that's something that kind of high level athletes would use, but actually it doesn't need to be that in depth for fences, because these things can be costly, and B, they're very time consuming when fences at a young age or at lower levels are actually trying to still learn the fundamentals of training. And so I think it's important that good quality habits are delivered to these athletes, and also as a coach like Nick is, to help mentor these young athletes to not be scared to use trial and error, not be scared to experiment different things, go to competitions and try different routines, because actually the biggest thing that people worry about is going to a routine and getting it wrong. But actually going to a competition, getting it wrong when you're younger or at a lower level is great, because when you get it wrong, you get experience, and then you can start to change things, adapt things to how it will suit you. And so I think that was one of the biggest things that's come for me as a senior athlete. It's still trying to keep that learning mindset. Actually, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to go through those kind of like ups and downs, because that's how you learn. And actually setting yourself up for a competition, some of it might work, some of it might not work, and that's great. Next time, change it and adapt it. And the idea of, if you lost to an opponent before, don't see drawing that opponent again as a threat. See it as an opportunity. And I think that's really what he's talking about here, is how can they look mentally at a situation like that. Well, if you draw somebody again, it's okay. If you lost them before, give yourself goals and challenges. I remember James Davis, who's a world-class fencer. He's based in San Francisco. I used to draw him at the Leon Paul Junior Series all the time. I used to meet him in the final all the time. And I've got about 36 silver medals from losing to James, every single one. But I tried to go into every fight thinking, all right, what can I do differently from what I did last time? And see it as an opportunity to learn, see an opportunity to gain experience. And actually, over time, as you gain all those experiences, you will start to find that you'll convert those into wins. But the learning mindset, the seeing things as an opportunity rather than a threat, is a great mindset to have for a younger or slightly lower level fencer that still needs to gain all of that experience. Chris, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think seeing things as an opportunity is a really great phrase. I don't think enough fencers see fencing and bouts and fencing itself as an opportunity to score hits. By working, you create opportunities, and drawing somebody you've had before, you may have won, you may have lost, can easily influence that. But I saw a quote not too long ago that said the best fencers have the shortest memory, because the best way to continue winning is to absolutely forget about what happened last. You might have won gold at World Cup, you might have come last at a domestic event. It has no bearing on it, because each match is a fresh opportunity to do something. And as you say, a fresh opportunity against an opponent you've met before, to try something new, to have a plan. I don't think enough fencers have a plan when they go into about, and know what they're trying to do, what moments they're trying to exploit, and what they're really trying to put down on the piece. And that I think it's just, you've said it all. It's such a good way forwards.
I actually love the phrase, the harder I train, the luckier I get. It's kind of a real part on a real take on the idea that actually, just doing it repeatedly to the best of your ability actually makes you luckier. It doesn't make you luckier. It is all a product of the efforts and the training and experience that you get.
Yeah, and Muhammad Ali, who's a great champion boxer, I think had a quote that said, "I hated every second of training, but I told myself, work hard now and live the rest of your life as a champion." And I love that. I think it's so cool.
That's true. There's another good one. These are all based at the center as well. There's another one that I really like that says something like train today, unknown, finish tomorrow. I can't remember, but it's basically trying to say that actually, maybe nobody knows you now, but actually the harder you train, actually tomorrow might be the day that you arrive. And that's it. That's the idea of that kind of opportunist moment that people work for. It's the idea of really, put the graft in now, because one day it'll all be worth it.
Yeah, definitely. And there was, just while we're having a bit of a quote fest, I saw one at my gym that said, "I may not be there yet, but I'm closer than I was yesterday." And I really like,
this is great.
Yeah, gradual. Gradual. I'm not there yet, but I'm a step closer, and that's what counts. I've moved forwards in some way.
Chipping away, absolutely. Well, it was a great question from Nick, and I really enjoyed that as well. So I think that kind of leads us very nicely to the end of this episode. And next week's podcast episode is going to be on nutrition and fuel. We know we've covered that in kind of various ways, but we'll go into it in a bit more detail, especially with me as a good carnivore and Chris as a vegan. So we'll have, I'm sure, lots of opposing ideas there, but it'll be great to debate.
Yeah, there'll be some good battles, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, remember to subscribe, review, and contact us. Subscribe and review, and even listen to us on Google, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and Transistor as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So make sure to get in touch and listen wherever you do that best. We have our Twitter page as well where you can send in questions. Ben, what's our Twitter handle?
The Twitter handle is @FencedInPodcast. Please send us emails on that. Send your questions in. We're loving the amount coming in. Really, really enjoyable, and it certainly makes us really think.
Absolutely. And tag us in anything that you're doing as well. We'll retweet it. That would be great. We'd love to see what people are doing at home, especially as it looks like this might be going on for a bit longer than what we all imagined.
Absolutely. And Chris is the brainchild of this great podcast that we're really both enjoying. And actually, he is the tech man. He's the man behind all of this. So when it comes to all of the stuff and the platforms this is on, I can wholeheartedly thank Chris because he is Mr. Tech Man, as I call him. But actually, his other alias is Chris. What's the name of your other alias?
Oh, well, I just want to say quickly, it's very kind of you to say, but you're the social man. I hide in the hole and do the tech bits, and you're out and about shouting about it. So yeah, I have a digital agency called J4G Design where I do graphic design logos, template work, but very importantly, I build websites for e-commerce and static websites as well. And actually some of the more notable ones that I've done recently are the new All-Star Room in UK website, Sword Fighting International for Nick Payne actually as well, and those are the fencing based ones, but there's loads of work you can see on my site, which is www.j4gdesign.co.uk/work. So make sure to have a look there, and if you're interested, get in touch.
And you know what? If you absolutely hate the podcast, but you want a new website, there you go. You've still learned something. You've still enjoyed it. So, but thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week.
See you then. Bye.
Bye.
The Fenced In podcast has been created in association with J4G Design, your one-stop user experience agency for all things digital, websites, graphic design, and technical support.